Show as per normal, just so people watching online know who is in the room. So me and Nigel.
Stu Piddington, Councillor.
Good morning everyone, Michelle Pye, Councillor.
Good morning, Scott Shannon, Councillor.
Kia ora, Nigel Trainer, CEO.
Andrew Dixon, Group Manager, Infrastructure.
Andrew Lester, Drainage and Water Manager.
Stacey Scott, Councillor.
Peter Boots, Councillor.
Kia ora, Owen Jackson, Timaru Ward Councillor.
Kia ora, good morning, Sally Parker, Councillor.
Councillor Alan Booth.
And so who have we got online? Mike.
Tēnā koutou, Mike Chatterley from Martin Jenkins.
Brilliant. Welcome, Mike, and thanks for being with us. So we'll pass now to perhaps the Andrews to lead us off, and the floor's yours.
Thank you. So basically, this is a workshop looking at some of the work that Martin Jenkins have done in investigating three options. First one is an in-house business unit type option, which is not status quo. It is basically ring-fencing the whole water operation in-house, but it still keeps users council services effectively. The second one is a water services organisation, or a CCO, which is just for Timaru, and the third one is a combined with 3 councils or 4 councils, depending on where those other councils stand. So we're looking at with Waimate, Mackenzie, and Waitaki is in the mix as well. So Waitaki are looking south as well as north, so they've got a foot in each camp, so to speak, at the moment. So probably best thing to do is pass it over to Martin Jenkins, who will run through the presentation and sort of explain the findings.
So just before that, Catherine Lancaster was to be here in person, but she's doing the Waimate Council meeting this morning, and when that's completed, she'll try and get here.
Thank you. So we're going to pass over to you, Mike. Take us through it. And we can see the presentation, so all good to go.
Thank you for that, and apologies for Catherine's absence. We have 4 councils actually across the country doing this all within about 30 to 40 minutes of each other. Look, so we are relatively new to Timaru District Council, but we are definitely not new to Local Water Done Well. So both myself and Nick Davis, one of our partners, have been involved in both Three Waters and Local Water Done Well for the last 5 years. And look, over the last 6 months, we have undertaken similar assessments to what we will walk through today, with well over a dozen councils, and are also undertaking joint modelling and establishment work across the country as well for a number of groupings there. So we have quite a good handle on the policy, the legislative requirements, as well as the different kind of situations and unique contexts that councils across the country are facing. So the presentation that we'll go through today is a draft assessment of the delivery options that Andrew has just noted, but this has been undertaken at pace, and normally something that we would have done on quite an iterative basis. So there are still some adjustments that will come through as we work with yourselves today and officers ahead of the 6 May meeting that you have coming up. So we're happy to take any questions that you have, either on the way through or at the end. In terms of what we'll cover today, is we'll just do a very quick recap of the previous obligations of Local Water Done Well, just a very rough overview of the kind of assessment criteria before we step through the assessment itself, and then take questions as we go. As we approach you'll need to make a decision. You'll need to decide which options you consult on. Broadly, you've got 3 choices. So continuing to deliver water services in-house, and as Andrew has noted, that does not mean the status quo. There are changes coming. One of the other options is establishing your own water services organisation, or it's also known as a CCO, and that would be solely owned by yourselves. And the alternative option there being joining a joint arrangement potentially with Waimate and Mackenzie, or another sub-option there being with Waitaki as well. What we really need to get out of today to continue working with your council officers and prepare for consultation is any guidance that you have on what you see as the emerging preferred option. So we have undertaken that high-level options assessment with that in mind. Now, I would just note that, we don't provide guidance as to, what we think is the best option for Timaru District Council. That's a decision for you and what is right for your community. And there'll be a number of different objectives beyond those that we have assessed, which you will likely be factoring into your own decisions. In terms of the obligations and what's changing, the first thing you kind of need to be aware of, obviously, and I'm sure you're already well aware, is the need to deliver a water service delivery plan by the 3rd of September 25. Now, there are a couple of things to note in that, and one is the new legislative obligations require you to be financially sustainable and viable in the long run, and a move to that by 1 July 2028. So to support that, there are a number of alternative structures that you can work through. And there's 3 that we have assessed on behalf of the council. And there are, of course, 2 others being the community trust models. Now, as far as we're aware of the 43 councils that we know are already out consulting, none of them are considering that joint trust option. And the main reason appears to be the complexity, but also the inability to borrow through the LGFA, so the much higher borrowing costs that those entities would face. And then, of course, the other one is the incoming regulation. So Te Mata Arawai is already well established and making waves. And then, of course, we do have economic regulation coming through, which will help drive efficiencies and monitor prices as well as investment. In terms of your obligations for consultation, the Water Services Preliminary Arrangements Act provides some streamlined procedures that mean you don't need to follow the full kind of ambit of the Local Government Act. But what it does require you to do, if you do take that opportunity, is to identify at least 2 options for delivering water services. And there must be an assessment of the advantages and disadvantages of those options, including clearly outlining which of those options is the council's proposal, which is also known as the preferred option. And as part of that, you will also need to be able to outline the potential impact on rates, council debt, levels of service, and of course, charges for water. As Andrew's already pointed out, there are 3 main options that have been assessed, and we understand that council officers have canvassed that full range and narrowed it down to these 3. So the first one is continuing to deliver water services in-house, but obviously, as I mentioned, there will be some changes necessary to meet those legislative and regulatory settings. One of the key ones being the ring fencing of water services, revenues, expenses and debt. And that will require separate reporting on that publicly as well. So one of the things that we know council officers are looking at is the establishment of an internal water services unit to support that. So that would still be entirely in-house, but it would be a fully dedicated water services unit. The other standalone option, of course, is establishing a water services organisation, which would take responsibility away from councils for those day-to-day operations, as well as planning. But equally, it would take away those obligations, so those expenses and those liabilities. Now, obviously, to go with that, revenue would move as well. But of course, being solely owned by Timaru District Council, there would be a substantive level of control that you would be able to retain over that entity. The third option is that joint arrangement with Waimate and Mackenzie, and the kind of, 3B, if you like, option, which is potentially having Waitaki in there as well. As we understand it, Waitaki is also looking at going further south and has expressed that that is their preferred approach. In terms of the structure of what these look like, it's relatively straightforward, obviously, for in-house delivery with that internal water services unit noted there before. In terms of water services organisations, shareholders will be able to appoint and remove board members, which is obviously a key element of control. The other thing that shareholders will be doing is issuing a statement of expectations to the water entity. Now, unlike a standard council control organisation, the entity will actually be legislatively obligated to give effect to that statement of expectations. So that's a significant level of control that's over and above what you would typically see in a CCO. Now, the other thing to note is that they can continue to borrow through the LGFA, and in case of a joint water services organisation, there would be no borrowing premium over and above that of the councils. The way the LGFA will set those borrowing costs would be essentially on the same basis as the parent and the owner councils. And so in the event that you're all in there together and you've all got a credit rating, the borrower margin will be no different to what you pay today. There is a slight difference with a standalone water services organisation, and the LGFA has indicated that there would be a very small 5 basis point premium on borrowing costs for a standalone water services organisation, but there may be, that may shift. They have indicated that they are looking to remove that premium. So what we've done is gone ahead and assessed these options on a comparative basis. And the way that we have done that is to take a 3-step approach. So we've undertaken a comparative assessment against a series of strategic objectives, which we'll outline shortly, but these have been based on the objectives of water services providers in the draft legislation. Now, water service providers, they don't just include water services organisation. The scope of that term in legislation will also include councils as well. We've also gone and looked at some key financial metrics, including affordability, financial sustainability, and within that is the ability for both council and those water service organisation options to meet the covenants that have been set out by the LGFA. Now, obviously, each of these options don't come without their own risks and different accountability structures. So we've also looked at that on a comparative basis. I'll just pause there and see if there are any immediate questions.
I think this is probably a lot of stuff we already covered, actually, quite frankly, no. So it's a bit like, I'm looking at your executive summary, it actually says nothing. I'm quite concerned about that. So, look, just get to the point. I mean, we've employed you guys to actually put some facts and figures in front of us to actually assist with our decision making. We actually know where we are. This is like a regurgitation. So I just read your executive summary, it says nothing, and this is not actually particularly helpful. It's wasting our time.
Alan, Mike hasn't presented to us before, so I think he's taking us through it and yeah, a bit of a recap, so I think we might just have to persevere. So, but taking your point, and we will get to the pointy end of it, but I think there's still value in taking everyone through, because this is going to be one of the bigger decisions we make, or the biggest decisions we make this year. So let's continue on.
Great, so, oh, sorry. Anything further? Sorry.
Sorry, can I just, I'm a wee bit, look, with Alan, we've read the document, so can we get to the pointy end? And also, you know, I guess my concern, which isn't covered, is if the two we're opting to go with aren't coming in with us, one or both, what happens then? That kind of the questions I had around that.
So just effectively, this document covers the three options, the pros and cons of those. So if you've read that, you fully understand that. And then it obviously shows you the impact of, financially, the impact for the ratepayer on the three different options. And at the moment, our cost is lower than what it's going to be. So there is an increase. So we're going to have to work out how we cover that off with consultation. And also the thinking, we need to think hard about not just now, but the 30 years. And what this is saying is that over the 30 years will be the in-house option, you'll be starting to butt up against your debt to revenue percentages, whereas the WSO has a lot more capability of borrowing higher than that. It can double the level. However, you have to be careful about what revenue is going through there. So the more revenue you have going through your WSO, the more capability it has to borrow. And that is probably one of the favourable ones for the joint WSO. However, in saying that, we are partnering with two small councils, and I always had a view that we should have at least had Ashburn and or Waitaki in there to give us that scale. And while this is giving us a joint one, it's not particularly giving the scale we require. And I think we've just got to go through the process and understand the risk and the levels of risk with each. Also, we're hearing on the grapevine that the in-house delivery models will get a lot more attention from ComCom than the WSO models. Personally, I think all councils, when they go out to the community is going to come back with option one, in-house delivery. I really believe that. And I think that that's been tested already by Waitaki with their LTP consultation. 40% of respondents said, leave it alone, keep it in-house. 28% said as WSO. So effectively, there was an appetite from the community to get into joint WSOs, and I think we will face that with all three councils. So the councils that are joining together are going to have to actually, they've got a tough decision to make straight after consultation. I could be proved wrong, but my gut screams at me that's what's going to happen.
I agree with you, Nigel. Of course they're going to come back and say, do it by yourself, because the thoughts of amalgamation and no one likes being told to do by the government. But they've made it clear they don't want all the territorial authorities to stand on their own. So, I mean, I think we have to go down the joint path, and I'm with you. It's a shame a bigger one didn't come on board. But once they're up and going, you may see some of them combine then. But I guess that's going to be a decision that maybe the council has to make despite what the ratepayers think for the benefit of the wider community and going forward. So it's just that. I did have one question though on page 26 where they said joint WSO, greater financial flexibility for council in the bottom of the second box as they redirect its financial capability. That's not quite true though, is it? Because we'll also lose the income from the water. So I wouldn't like that to go out as it reads, because it reads as though if we get rid of water, we're going to have a whole lot of more money to do other things. And that's just simply not true.
Yeah, that's quite correct. And the other thing to keep in mind too, it's still the same community paying. So whether if it goes out to a CCO and they increase their debt, it's still going to be the same customers having to pay back their debt and service it.
I think for council, two of the bigger discussion points is ensuring there's a shareholder council and what the views are on that, and also the harmonisation, what are the views on that. Now, if you look at our one, if you look on page 18, it's telling us that our internal water, the cost will increase to 1,900. The WSO is about the same. I'm not quite sure why it's under the internal, because I would have thought the Timaru Council WSO would be more expensive. 3 council WSO, it's cheaper, but with the 4 council having introduced one more council being Waitaki, it goes up. Now, that is a real key point in terms of, do you harmonise or do you keep the cost to the various areas quite distinct?
Can I just ask about harmonisation? Sorry, Councillor Booth. Is there a legal requirement to harmonise the pricing? Because these figures actually show that the 4 council, without harmonisation, deliver the cheapest result to our ratepayers.
There is no legal requirement to harmonise at all. And they've been very clear in the last few communications that harmonisation is not required.
And that's the problem with the whole conversation. When it went back to Three Waters, everyone jumped to who's paying for who. And no matter who you talk to, they just didn't want to not have that conversation. But we can protect ourselves, and I think that's what we have to, that's going to be the number one question. Who's paying for who? And we just say, look, you're paying for your own water for the next X amount of years, and just build that into our shareholder agreement. If we can answer those questions, I mean, it's a bit of a learning out of the Alpine Energy consultation, if you like, the questions that couldn't be answered. Let's just answer those questions straight up to help educate. And I mean, I'm with Stu, obviously, that joint approach makes 100% sense. Is there anyone that around this table conscious that everyone will be at different stages of understanding, potentially with water? Yes, you've read that, but is there one that needs more information from Mike as far as this workshop goes, or are you comfortable heading towards some direction on where we're going as far as preferred option? I think we're probably all pretty similar, I'm assuming. Is there anyone that's not on the joint water service delivery?
Yeah, I think we do have a reasonably good understanding to Councillor Piddington and Booth's point. However, we've just had another question here around harmonisation and what have you. So, there are a lot of points here. We do understand the fundamentals of it. I still think, no matter how much you read this, it gives opportunities to ask those questions through the process to enable it, make sure that we all know. I don't know if you all think it's a waste of your time. I'm very sorry about that. I honestly believe there are questions in here. I've read it through once. I'd like to read it more. I still have the fundamentals that we've talked about it so often, and we understand the concept of where we're saving money. But I think we're losing an opportunity here by not going through this.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, what part don't you understand? I mean, harmonisation, that hasn't been, that's like, it's been right up front in the first instance that we actually don't have to harmonise those prices. So, and even debt can be kept isolated if you really want to. I guess the Waitaki example of not, their consultations sort of indicate they weren't very keen, but, that just goes, in my mind, that just shows the offer that they put up to the people is quite disjointed and geographically quite stupid, that they suggest to go with...
They haven't done that yet.
Okay, but that just doesn't make sense, whereas our proposal of South Canterbury with our close neighbours actually makes a hell of a lot of sense, and I think people would see that if we put that option up. So,
Personally, I think we should be going through this because this is an open meeting, it's online, and it's a great opportunity to, if there is anyone watching, it's a great opportunity to actually do some education.
I'd just like to point out, I mean, you probably are in a better position because you were in the steering committee. So, of course, you know it intimately and we'd expect you to. Our biggest problem around harmonisation is harmonising back to where we were with the legacy we had under the previous government and the processes of how we were going to lose this, is to somehow harmonise with the community and get them to understand this. And that's the problem. So we should all leave this room understanding it absolutely 100%. And I think, again, we'll lose the opportunity to do that if we don't go through it.
Just like to note that, price harmonisation, we don't even have that now. in our own organisation. Yeah, the waters are still separately charged on the different areas. So wastewater is harmonised, but the other services aren't. So, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alrighty, I think on that note, I think we see value in continuing. Mike, obviously you've picked up on some of the conversations, questions, comments that we've had, but do you want to just keep us going through so we can be more informed? Thanks.
We'll keep pressing through, and we can go through harmonisation in a bit more detail as we come to the financials. In terms of the comparative assessment against those strategic objectives, which are just outlined here, and look, they're pretty self-explanatory, and I think they've been on the screen for long enough probably, so I won't go through these in any detail, but really they come down to efficient delivery, affordability, and making sure that your obligations, both regulatory and the expectations of your community, can be met. So these assessments, I will point out, are very comparative and relative to each option. And we're still working through some of the finer detail with the team. So these may shift slightly, but overall, in terms of the relative assessment, but I think we're broadly comfortable between the team and ourselves of the options. The key thing to note down the bottom there is you'll see the scale, and it's shifted probably slightly since the version that you've got, and that's just picking up on some of the conversations that we have. What's important to note is that yellow colour that you can see, for example, on the top left there, doesn't mean that it doesn't meet it. It's still consistent. It's just that relative to the other options, it has a slightly higher degree of risk. So in terms of being able to, effectively, efficiently deliver water services while remaining financially sustainable, one of the key things to note is that, while you do have a credit rating and can borrow to 280% debt to revenue, your LTP forecasts do have your overall council getting pretty close to that at about 240% against your internal limit of 250%. That does begin to track down closer towards 220% by the end of your LTP period. But what I would note is that, looking beyond that period, you've got nearly $1 billion worth of water investment forecast in your infrastructure strategy. So there is quite a lot of additional investment that will require borrowing that will need to be made. And of course, that will put pressure on affordability as you go through that. In terms of a joint water organisation, if we jump to the other end of the spectrum, we do believe that there are both scale and scope efficiencies that can be delivered there that would be greater than either in-house or, of course, your own standalone water services organisation. Now, one of the things to note is that a water services organisation borrows very differently to councils, even though it does continue to borrow through the joint water organisation. And that gives it an ability to leverage debt to a much greater ability. And what that will essentially do is spread the costs of that infrastructure over a longer period of time. And so the main point of that is that it does start to drive greater intergenerational equity in the investment. But what I would note is that we don't see that financing benefit as an efficiency benefit. It's just that there is greater capacity there from a financial point of view. Now, some of those benefits can be captured if you had your own water services organisation, but our assessment is that relative to that joint water organisation, they would be a lot weaker there. In terms of continuing to integrate, your planning across your services, so transport, land use, etc. Obviously, those two standalone options, whether that's in-house or your own water services organisation, provide the strongest level of integration. You have that direct control. But to points made by councillors before, when you do start to join with some of your neighbours, they will have different drivers and needs for investment. And they will need to be balanced across the water services organisation's ability to invest, particularly in terms of capacity. And so that is one of the risks that we have noted there. And of course, ring fencing, or as was noted before, can help kind of remedy that, if you like, or mitigate that risk.
And just on that point, Mike.
In terms of
just on that point, Mike, we
Mm-hmm.
are, the three councils are looking at doing this. We are different. So if you think about Timaru, we, of the three and the four, we have the biggest industrial area. And even when we were looking at the south ones, we again had the biggest industrial area. So our driver is about ensuring we've got good water and waste for that industrial area as well as residential, which is different. Obviously Mackenzie, they've got a drive around tourism, making sure that they've got that covered, and Waimate is probably more rural. So we are different.
That's actually a good point. But the other point to probably emphasise there is that given your scale, depending on how you structured shareholding, you would probably have quite a bit of influence there as well. When it comes to affordability, all options are affordable. So continuing to deliver water services in-house, if we look at the standard benchmark of 2.5% of median household income, that your council projections do indicate that water services would continue to be affordable. So they are roughly $1,500 per connection today. That does reflect the removal of commercial supply and trade waste revenue, but it does include rural connections as well. Going forward, those are expected to peak at about $2,100 a year in FY30, but then they drop back to around $1,900 per year by the end of your LTP period. Now, the main risk to those projections are, if you continue to get close to your internal borrowing limit, noting you are peaking there at about 240%, you would need to increase revenues to manage that down. There is some improvement in affordability in the short term under a standalone water services organisation, but I would say that is a one-off benefit. So the benefit that you're seeing there in affordability is mainly due to the changes in financing structure. Now, there are some small efficiencies that we would expect through a dedicated management structure and that independent board, but there are also higher operating costs that come in to play. So those higher operating costs essentially cancelled out, if you like, by those small efficiencies. So the gain there is relatively marginal. The Joint Water Services Organisation, there are different benefits there from an affordability perspective, depending on whether you price harmonise or not, and of course who your partner councils, would be there. Now, the key thing here is that we have looked over a 10-year horizon in this options report. But the efficiencies of a joint water organisation, when we've gone through those and looked at international examples, they take a long time to kick in. So you're really seeing very limited efficiency gains early on. So by FY34, within the next 10 years, they don't really start to settle for another 10 to 12 years beyond that. And that's where you start to see that benefit in the long run. In terms of remaining council operations and how viable they are, apologies, something seems to have gone wrong here with the colouring. Your in-house delivery should be slightly improved there with that assessment. There is obviously the least impact on council staff through that, but the main risk there, again, continues to be related to debt. Noting that a significant proportion of your debt is related to water, and we'll touch on the implications of that shortly. But what it is essentially doing is limiting the ability to invest in other council services. And of course, with the economic regulator coming in, as well as Taumata Arowai, you will have, I guess, less flexibility around some of those water investment decisions because they will be in part guided by those two regulators. Again, if you set up your own water services organisation, there would probably be a more minimal impact on council staff. And while there would be some transitional costs, they could be relatively minor depending on how you set that up. And equally, there could be shared service agreements back to your council to kind of minimise any impact as well. The key thing here, and it does also apply to the Joint Water Services Organisation, is that you will need to guarantee the debt of the water entity. Now, we understand from the LGFA that will not impact on your borrowing through them, so you will continue to be able to leverage to 280% without factoring in any of the water-related debt if you have a 100% owned water organisation.
Before you go on, Mike.
From a joint perspective.
Just before you go on, Mike, the remaining council operations are viable. On the joint, you've got it as green. I would anticipate that that's probably not quite green because we would have to pull out overheads somehow. So the overheads would have less to be spread across. And that's, we did some work on that earlier, didn't we? And it was quite a significant number that has to be pulled back. And that's obviously in your back office functions, your payrolls, your finance, your IT, your HR, all of those functions.
That was going to be my question. I don't think we've got, it says here council will be in a stronger financial position, but I don't think we've really got a clear picture of what council is going to look like without water in it. Like we've done some modelling, but actually thought about structure, not just finances, but structure and things like that. So I think before we go out to the community, we need to be a bit clearer on that. And I just wonder, Mike, why in the TDC only WSO, you talk about the effects of guaranteeing the debt, but you don't in the joint WSO, because we've still got to have a joint guarantee on the debt. So it felt like there should be some commentary on that in the joint one, which made me also think that we don't quite have the colour right there.
Agree, the colour, apologies, something's gone wrong there. Those should essentially be inversed or at least all that lighter green. This is a slightly cut down version of the full report. So some of the points have been taken out just to make it more legible on screen, so you're not looking at mouse-sized font. In terms of the stronger financial position, definitely take the point around the impact, particularly of stranded overheads. Some of those will be transitional and some of those will be enduring as well. And I will go into a bit more detail in terms of the actual numbers from a purely debt to revenue perspective, both from a percentage but a raw number perspective as well. Have I missed any other comments before we move on to the next slide?
Just a quick one. I think just to put the corporate overheads into perspective, I think water is picking around about $4 million of it at the moment, so it's quite significant.
I think that's the wider opportunity, and I know we can't guarantee it through this, but that's why the three councils, as a bare minimum, need to be working together stronger on so many other things, because we're all going to be in the same boat. But there again, for a population of 65,000, we need to get a bit smarter. So hopefully we have lots of people open to those conversations.
And the reality of this is going to be some pain before there's gain because, well, we're also going to have stranded overheads. The indication is it'll cost more to deliver. So the reality is this may not work for 10 years, to shuffle all these things out. But again, we've been instructed by the government to look at this. So we're looking for the best opportunity, not only today, but in the long term for our ratepayer base.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You can't think about this in isolation of just water. It is so much bigger with reform that's happening. So those councils that are just simply thinking about water are probably getting it wrong.
I don't think, I think the thinking about it wider than water, actually, you need to change your lens. Because at the moment, I think the thinking is we take water away where we're left, and how the heck do we make that work, rather than actually, this is best for water, so now what do we do with councils? And I think that's getting to your point of, can we share more?
Well,
and
that's
actually
it.
bring
This
the
is
costs
the
down?
start of a strategic discussion on how we deliver local government services to our community. What's the best, most efficient way to do that? Yeah.
And the problem being is ourselves as elected members, and same in Waimate and Mackenzie, no one wants to lose their job, neither does the CEO, neither do the senior staff. So while it might make sense, it's pretty hard to get that across the line. So you rattle the parochial flag and we'll be here till the end, which just isn't going to happen.
No, that's it. It is the moment in time that we do have to think past ourselves. If we're not here at the next election, but we make the right decisions, set our communities up for success. But you're right, that takes, it does take some courage. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to watch this across the country. But, yeah, it might play out at the next election if councils don't get this right. And look, government want change. The last government wanted it, this government wanted it. They're doing it probably a little bit more subtly. But actually, there's an opportunity to shape it if we get ahead of it. Yeah, not so subtle.
I guess, we have an obligation to our ratepayers to set them up for success, and this is part of it. And so we have to supply the best services at the lowest cost. And it makes absolute sense that we consolidate these specialised services into one entity, bringing 3 sets of separate costs into one, and having the ability to provide our own professional services within our own organisation. This, all those auditing fees, all that duplication in one region that has the same, basically, water catchment. There's so many things that make sense in my mind, and whatever the result is for the council moving forward, where those stranded overheads occur, they'll be dealt with because we'll have to, just as we deal with things as they occur now. So that's really the bottom line I see, and that's how we need to look at this, and that for the future of our region and how decisions are going to be made in the future, this is really the starting gun.
Getting a little bit off track, but I tend to agree. But from what I've seen briefly online of other councils, the feedback is perceived loss of ownership of their assets. So that has to be a major focus of any community engagement that we do, because I think everyone can get the numbers and go, yep, numbers-wise it makes sense, but it's that perceived loss of control of assets. So we need to really focus on that in our engagement.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, this council took the government to court on property rights. Yeah. And so that's a key one that we have to get through. But it was also about being able to shape your own destiny. This is the model that allows us to do that, to protect those property rights for successive generations. So, and there again, it's the shareholders' agreement. So this is why I think through the consultation we do need to all be very up to speed on this, because we need to have a really solid, this I think it needs more investment than the LTP. It needs us all to be, really up to speed and having those conversations and educating people. Yeah. But we are not elected members to take us off track. It's not like us, is it? Where did we get to? We'll throw you back to Mike.
Thanks for that. I think they're all very good points, and we'll go further into detail around that ownership and control as well shortly. Just in terms of infrastructure resilience, and I think it's already been touched on, we do consider that joint water service organisation is in a stronger position, and that is mainly because of its financial capacity to invest, as well as, I think someone else has already made the point, that coordinated planning across a wider services area. by comparison, the council's water infrastructure may be more exposed to some longer term risks and less able to manage those in the event of a natural disaster or extreme weather event, but that is mainly due to the current debt position. In terms of protecting public health, both options, or all three options, I should say, have pretty good alignment to that objective across there, and that slightly stronger alignment on the joint option as well as the standalone option, again, just come down to managing those kind of investment challenges, particularly with resource consents expiring and a slightly unknown regulatory environment there. Although I would note a slight softening in some of the expected stormwater obligations as well. And just finally, in terms of responsibilities to iwi and hapu, obviously in-house delivery would allow the council to continue to build on those existing relationships, but a new water organisation that is joint at least would need to develop those relationships and work with iwi on their own. So in terms of the summary, this is a visual representation. I think there is a slight issue there, sorry, with that remaining council operations are viable. We'll adjust that before the final report. But broadly, what you can see there is that the Joint Water Services Organisation presents slightly stronger alignment to those objectives than the standalone Water Services Organisation. But as I noted earlier, we are looking to kind of just build a bit more nuance into this assessment with officers over the next 24 hours.
Just on that, Mike, the protects and promotes public health and the environment, meet regulatory requirements, while as we sit here today with resource consents in place, in 10 years' time when the wastewater is up, that could change markedly. And the issue there is what comes through the regulations. And right at the moment with the drafts, we're at risk there, which means all three options will be at risk. But you would have to assume that the two options to the right have probably got, well, they may not, have got a bit more capability of meeting that. Is that correct, you two?
I actually think for across that, they're all pretty equal, to be honest. I think we do have that capacity to go through. We're probably, on the joint, we may be better able to leverage across the areas geographically, seeing as, shared catchments for water sources and stuff like that. So that could be a slightly higher, but I think they're actually pretty close.
Yeah, I think in regard to wastewater, there's a potential liability of about $100 million on today's dollars for having to upgrade that if new standards are imposed that require that we can't discharge industrial waste straight out to sea. So that's going to be a huge burden on a WSO as well as in-house. So yeah, they are pretty similar.
Yeah, that consent's about 20 years away. 20, yeah.
You're seeing those changes, that's not coming through in the current standards, though, is it?
This comes down to that definition of the open ocean. So that was, so we're in conversation, we've put in submission feedback on, it's a bit hard because they haven't released the draft standards. It's a discussion document and a technical report, but there's a bit of a mismatch between them. And where they've landed in for an open ocean definition, we're excluded.
And which comes down to the length of our
pipe. Length of pipe and the dilution factor, the depth and the dilution from the modelling. Saying that, and maybe slightly off topic, the modelling and the 10, 15 years of environmental data shows no concern at all. It meets all the criteria that they're after, but because they've gone with 500 metres and 10 metres of depth, we don't meet that criteria.
Yeah. But these guys put a very good technical submission through to support that. Alrighty, back to you, Mike.
Thanks for that. We'll just move through now to the kind of key financial metrics. But just before I do, this is a combination of both looking at your kind of internal numbers, but also looking at those joint options as well. Now, there are a number of assumptions that underpin a lot of these, and in the full report, there is an appendix there that goes into detail for the joint options, and included in that is a detailed outline of the assumptions. Including around efficiencies, establishment costs, etc., as well as a quite detailed note on how efficiencies were arrived at. In terms of the kind of key metrics here, the main thing we're looking at is the average cost per connection, as well as peak efficiencies. And so what you can see here is that there is some benefit to establishing your own water services organisation. But as I mentioned before, that benefit is really coming from a change in financing structure rather than efficiencies. And you can see that coming through quite clearly on the graph on the right-hand side. So what you can see there is that 1%, and sorry, that's probably very tiny font for you. Now, that's the level of efficiency that we think will have been met overall by the end of your LTP period if you were to set up a standalone water services organisation. But then by the time you get to FY45, it's still only going to reach peak of around 3.7%. Now, when you contrast that to a three-council water services organisation, you can see there that that's at 3.6% by the end of the LTP period. But reaching 16.5% by FY45. Now, I realise those numbers are quite big and often there's a lot of challenge around them. We've done a lot of research into this and also looked at and have been involved in actually the Water Care Charter and the efficiency obligations there in terms of a more local obligation. And their efficiency targets from the economic regulation they're facing are much higher than what you see here. I don't have the numbers to hand, sorry. Now, I would just note that the prices on the left-hand side here are harmonised. In terms of non-harmonised, you would be looking at a lower price here of roughly $1,670 per connection, and a non-harmonised price in that four-council one of roughly $1,640. So if you don't harmonise or you don't ring-fence, there's a very marginal difference for your council between those three and four council options. So that's kind of a cost per connection, if you like, and those numbers, sorry, do, as I mentioned before, exclude trade waste as well as commercial water supply, just given your level of industrial use. So these are more reflective of standard urban and standard rural connection costs. In terms of the council's debt position, and I think this was raised earlier by council, on the left-hand side, you can see your current forecast debt position based on your LTP and the information provided to us. So your internal limit there is at 250%, and that top graph, that top line shows you the LGFA limit. Now, when you remove water services, you can see there that debt does drop quite significantly. And that does provide for a lot more headroom. Now, unfortunately, sorry, when we sent this through, we didn't include the actual raw numbers of the change in ability to borrow. So right now, with water services included, when you reach your peak debt to revenue of, I think it was 236%, you've got roughly $25 million worth of debt capacity against your current forecast revenue. Now, if you remove water services, it's going to peak at roughly 184%, which actually provides you 124 million of headroom against your council limit using only your other revenue sources. So there is obviously increased capacity there. Now, just because there's increased capacity doesn't mean that you should utilise that, but obviously what it does do is give you a bit more of a buffer for a rainy day there. We've already touched briefly on affordability, but as you can see there, it does remain within that standard benchmark for those rural and urban connections across the forecast period. And so a joint water services organisation would simply improve that due to both efficiencies and that change in financing structure with probably greater benefits beyond that forecast period. So just before we go into the kind of ownership and control mechanisms, are there any queries on those numbers?
Whereabouts have you got your base assumptions from? Have they been provided to you by our council officers, or have you, I see I'm looking at a page where you've got base assumptions, and you've got a CEO earning 400,000, a CFO 300,000, and an establishment cost of $9 million for 3 councils. Is that $9 million each, or is that combined $9 million?
That 9 is combined, and that would be capitalised. And the way we look at those establishment costs is they're really the investment costs, if you like, in terms of setting that entity up for success. And I would note that the model isn't sensitive to that. So in terms of stress testing, we doubled that cost to just see what the impact would be. And it only makes $2 or $3 per connection cost difference if we were to double that to 18 million, for example. In terms of those management costs, we've looked at kind of council salaries across the country for those sorts of roles, looked at Watercare and obviously other utility providers as well to kind of benchmark that, if you like. Now that may change. You may wish to provide some direction around that. They are just base assumptions, and we've just been wanted to be very clear on what those are there. So those base assumptions are a combination of supplied by council officers or developed by us independently.
Have you got any real life experience savings in regards to other councils or other entities who have done this, such as Auckland Water? And we did hear from a previous person that indicated that we would get at least 10% up to 20% savings.
Yes, I think we've got efficiency, kind of, I guess, the output of the efficiency assumptions here for you. So you can see there, it's under a 4 council, it would definitely be stronger, but there's not a huge difference, as you can see there, between the 3 and the 4 council model. And you could see that coming through in that very marginal non-harmonised benefit of, I think it was roughly $40 off the top of my head between the 3 and 4 council water services organisation. We can send through, if you like, some more information in terms of the efficiency targets that Watercare has been set. And they have previously set a 4% year-on-year efficiency target, which would see this at nearly 40%. By comparison. Now that hasn't been fully achieved in the past, but they have achieved north of 2.5%. And look, those numbers that you can see there are based on, so I'm just trying to find those efficiency numbers, a 0.9% per year efficiency. So that's how they start to compound over time. Equally, the way these were derived was through quite a lot of research looking internationally, both in the UK, but much closer to home in Australia and the Victorian experience there. The scale and the nature of their governance arrangements are more akin to what we're expecting here. And there is some graphs in the detailed joint modelling report that actually set out what the efficiency targets and what efficiency they have actually achieved over time as a point of reference if you want further reading. Any other questions?
I was just going to say the Watercare Charter has got 4% year on year for the first 3 years of the charter to go through. WICs were basing it around 15% efficiency savings, but that was with quite a large capital renewal program. Accelerating that was a big one. I think, I'm not sure if it's gone out yet around the analysis in here, so it's got all the Victorian utilities where that's been all benchmarked through.
I think what I was referring to, I was thinking we've heard some examples of 15% savings, and here we're looking at less than 1%, which I find quite hard to believe when we're looking at consolidating 3 units.
Yeah, I think intentionally they're just going very, very conservative, which makes sense.
I think the previous had quite overcooked the efficiencies and when you'd actually see them. So doing accelerated capital renewals, there's time for payback. You've actually got to get out and get in front and start to get all of that in place, which takes you 10, 15 years to go through. So that's the big one, yeah. Then you'll see it later down the track, but they'd baked it in right at year one.
I think it was a very helpful point, Andrew, in terms of they are very conservative efficiency assumptions from our perspective, but we would rather be conservative than overstate the possibility.
I think actually.
Anything further before I move on to
it's Nigel.
the control?
Yes, Nigel here.
Ownership arrangements.
If you can hold the cost when you first go into this to the ratepayer, then you are invariably creating efficiencies that are over and above that 1%. The reason for that is we are getting more costs thrown at us through levies and audits and so forth. And if you can hold the cost, all of that will be efficiency. And if you stand back and think about it, you should be able to get efficiencies out because all these water departments are running now. Why would they increase their costs? There's no reason for it. They should actually be able to pull them back a bit. But the initial start is pulling that back to actually pay for that. All the extra stuff that you're going to get.
When you consolidate, put something together, you'd work out, you'd get your assets, put them in a big pool and work out how you're going to do it with your existing assets.
And to be honest, it's quite hard to model. And this is conservative.
That's taking it for granted that all of them are starting on day one at a level where they should be based on what the government now has said, where the end result should be. In other words, us, in terms of our collaboration with the other three, what is the pinch point for them at the moment for where they probably should have done and what they should have done in terms of their investment. So.
And when you look at the capital investment going forward, there's no real shockers in there, and they actually complement each other. So if you think about the other two councils, in year 11ish, there's wastewater for Tekapo. That's the biggest thing they've got to do. The rest of us probably not in bad shape. And Waimati's put quite a bit of effort in their water systems as well. So they're not in bad shape. So effectively, we are similar.
Another question. Do you want to just carry on there, Mike?
Great. So in terms of water services organisations, none of these options are without risk. So obviously, you could set one of these up and end up with governance failure at the board level. They're not performing, for example, or they're not meeting your statement of expectations. Now, there are a number of protections in legislation, as well as obligations for them to report to shareholders at minimum 6 monthly, and as shareholders, you can, of course, direct that to be much more frequent. Equally, workforce capability. There is potentially some tension here. Of the 43 councils who are out consulting now, for example, there are 23, I think, of them, or 29 of them, who are looking at setting up a water services organisation as their preferred option. Now, obviously, that will create some tension in terms of finding board members who have the appropriate kind of capability to govern those entities as well. Equally, there could be some workforce competition between the water services organisations, but that could also apply to councils as well. The balance sheet is an important one, and obviously every council, goes in with a different debt and revenue position into these organisations, and I think that really is more reflective of where councils are at in their investment and asset life cycle. And so over time, those will change, but it will be important to make sure that those entities are, sound financially, and the LGFA covenants should help to drive that. Now, of course, you will also need to provide the guarantee, as was mentioned before, but that does provide another avenue for you to put some control on the entity, because obviously as the guarantor, you will be able to put some restrictions and obligations around that. The main thing, though, is how do you make sure that there are alignment between the member councils? And as noted, there are some very different drivers. You have industrial needs. Mackenzie has both growth and tourism demands, for example, and they can often be quite different and may lead to a competing need for resources, if you like. So being able to arrive at a clear and consistent statement of expectations that's issued by the shareholders, and that does get issued singularly, so that does have to be joint, will be an important process. So if you do enter one of these, as was noted before, the shareholder agreements and your voting rights within a shareholding council, as well as the obligations associated with that, will be important considerations. The other thing we've just got noted here is, what are the different mechanisms for control and influence? Because the reason we put this in is they're not a typical council-controlled organisation, and there are a number of differences there. So obviously, if you've got that internal water services unit that just sits within council, there is essentially no formal ownership right, but effective ownership, of course. Whereas a water services organisation, there are different ways that you could structure that shareholding and those voting rights as well. There, and it will also need to be a company as well, which is similar to a CCO. The key thing, though, is the difference in governance arrangements. So we've already touched on it in terms of your ability to directly appoint and remove directors, and where you are in a joint situation, that would need to be done through the Shareholders' Council, and the Constitution would also set out the composition of the board in terms of competency requirements beyond those that sit in legislation as well. On the other hand, CCOs, the governors are appointed by the owning councils, but there is a little bit less kind of direction that you can have generally there. In terms of strategy, the Water Services Organisation must prepare a water services strategy. Now, that legislatively must be consistent with the statement of expectations that shareholders issue. Whereas for a CCO, they only kind of need to be reflective of statements of intent, so they're not actually legislatively obligated to give effect to it. It more comes down to intention. So that direction setting, it's quite similar. And you will be able to set additional direction through shareholders' agreements and the Constitution as well. So, for example, you can, and this is clear in the draft bill at the moment, you would be able to direct water entities to more directly engage with consumers. So it's more akin to what local government does when consulting with ratepayers. Accountability, again, this comes back to both the governance arrangements and that direction setting. But there is very strong accountability back to you as shareholders, and as I mentioned before, your ability to direct more accountability to the community. There will be, a standard annual report and financial statements around that, and there are also at minimum 6 monthly obligations to engage with shareholders and monitor and report on performance. And there is an opportunity to increase that to quarterly as well. Equally, you do have the economic regulator there as well. On the other hand, for a CCO, generally not subject to economic regulation, other than if you happen to own some interests in an electricity company. But the other accountability arrangements are probably less prescriptive and more open to what a council would decide to do. And then community engagement, I've already touched on there. In terms of some of the kind of key risks, resource competition is one that we've talked about. And one of the benefits of water services organisation is if you've got dedicated water staff. The previous Three Waters Reform Programme did a lot of work looking at the future workforce of water services, and did see that water organisations would, have likely a stronger ability to attract and retain water-specific staff. It is a difficult one to mitigate, but there are potential small things that you can do to manage that. The scale and lower debt ceiling do limit the ability for a standalone water services organisation to respond as much as a joint water services organisation. But of course, there are abilities to manage that through treasury and financial policies, and as I mentioned before, any restraints that you want to put on debt or otherwise for a water services entity. The biggest concern, though, I think that most people have noted is that loss of control and influence by council and communities. Now, there are some measures in legislation to help manage that, and an ability to kind of take that further through those negotiated instruments such as a constitution and shareholders agreement and the statement of expectations. But they are one more step removed from council. There is no way of kind of getting around that. I guess the flip side of that is the economic regulator and Taumata Arawai will kind of start to drive certain investment outcomes, if you like. So it won't tell you exactly where to invest, but it will require you to meet certain obligations and be extremely transparent around how those are met. And then those transition risks and potential risk of higher costs as a result of water services organisations are compelling risks. And would need to be carefully kind of managed and identified as well through any establishment phase. That kind of wraps it up. But happy to take questions. As noted, we do have a detailed report which will be finalised. Trying to reflect any comments from the session here today, as well as any further direction from council officers ahead of the 6 May meeting. But as noted at the outset of this, very keen to hear whether there's a preferred kind of emerging option, just as we all work together on the draft consultation materials. And I have noted the points made throughout this conversation in terms of what's important to your community and queries around how you make certain things quite clear to the community as well.
Awesome, thanks, Mike. Can I just get a nod from everyone? Everyone's pretty comfortable with the joint water service model as preferred? There's no one that's not on that page? Just check with Gavin. No, so yeah, Mike, I'm getting circles with Alan. I think he's nodding. So no, we're 100% on board with that as sort of preferred option. Obviously, we've got to go through the meeting and we'll discuss that in depth then, but as far as some guidance, I think that makes sense. Yeah, and a question, Michelle.
I just think I'd be quite keen to flesh out the difference between the 3 and the 4 joint in relationship to control. And we talked about this in a workshop before, but assuming, or depending on how you structure your shareholding, the Southern Group talked about 1 share per council, which initially I didn't think was such a good idea, but if you're always going to get your assets back, I thought it doesn't matter. But with a three council organisation, every council has control because majority transactions, 75% change to the constitution, 75%. So effectively, you need unanimous decisions. 4 council, 3 councils could override the other council, and I think it's important to flesh that out in any consultation document around control, because having 3 councils gives us more control, even if 4 without harmonisation is a better economic result.
And I think there's also, ultimately from Timaru District's point of view, we want to ensure, and this is one of the challenges, I remember asking Grant Robertson, can you guarantee that our asset management plans and infrastructure strategy would go ahead in the timing that we'd planned, and they couldn't guarantee that. So we couldn't answer the question with the revenue that was generated in our district, was it going to pay for, water service delivery in our district? That would have been helpful if they could have answered that. But in regard to this, I think we can, within Constitution and Shareholders Agreement, we can iron all that out, so actually no one's going to lose as far as their aspirations for their own district, and that you're having constant investment.
I think it would also be good to maybe in an FAQ type section cover off what happens if only one other council wants to join with us or no, and what our thinking is around that. And does that change our preferred, well, obviously would change our preferred option, but would we still CCO with ourselves or one other, and the kind of advantages of doing so?
That was a similar question to what I was thinking. How do you shape that? Because if we go out with our preferred option, and so do Mackenzie and Waimate District Council, but their communities go no, what is our fallback position? Do we go to the standalone water service agreement or water service entity thing, and in the hope that one day we become joint? Like how does this, what's our fallback? Sorry.
I guess the answer to your own question, Stacey, it makes sense to go to a standalone organisation, because then if someone else comes, you're set to go. You don't have to untangle it all. You're sitting there ready to go. So even if Waimate and Mackenzie don't do the right thing and go alone, we're set to partner someone else. Yeah, the only other thing is we need to make it quite clear what harmonisation means, because if people are fearful of that. Is Timaru going to pay for Mackenzie's? Is Mackenzie going to pay for Waimate? We need to be clear what that means and our thoughts on it.
Where does Downlands go with this? Because obviously...
Well, Downlands would go with it.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because obviously that's Mackenzie and Waimate District ratepayers are in that system. So it'd be interesting, what is the percentage? I should probably know that. Like, of Waimate ratepayers, how many are on Downlands? Is it 10%?
I'm not sure, about 14%, I think.
Oh, yeah, okay, that's quite high. I'm one of those.
14% of Downlands.
So, yeah, Waimate's got 14% of Downlands, but I think it's as a percentage of their community ratepayer, I think it's a bit lower than that. Yeah.
I think council has to think really thoroughly about if, for whatever reason, the other 2 councils say no, that we're doing whatever, something else. So you've probably got 3 options left here, and maybe there's the game Waitaki's playing, is that they're going out saying we want to be in a joint WSO. They've got 2 options for the WSO. whereas we're heading to one option. So that needs to be thought through by you people in terms of, okay, what are the priority orders? Obviously, our 3 or 4 is number 1, maybe. Is going back to Southern a number 2, or are we going to stand alone?
So I think this is a bit of an iterative process in the fact that we have to get to a point where we've got to deliver a water service delivery plan. And come September, we would have been through consultation, we would have delivered that in some shape or form. And then we're only at the end of 25, we're talking about these being set up by mid-27. I think that's quite consistent across the country on where that's landing. There's quite a bit of time in that you can then go and have further conversations. And I think there's a lot of councils that are still open to that. So I don't think although we're consulting now, there's still some work that can be done to,
But if all 3 councils agreed, or 4 councils agreed that they're going to do this joint WSO, we'd have one water service delivery plan for all 4.
yeah.
Whereas if we don't, we'll have our own. I don't know
totally.
where that sits then if you change it.
Yeah, we do have to produce this water service delivery plan with the option that we are wanting to pursue.
Yes.
So it's not as quite as flexible, but yeah, you're right, there is opportunity later on to actually look at modifying that position.
Yeah, totally. I think within that period, government, DIA aren't going to say, hey, no, if you want to further work together across other councils in that period.
I think that is the risk, is that your WSO, water service delivery plan, gets rejected.
Yeah, but it would be after, the conversation would be after you've got, So the challenge, our immediate challenge on that water service delivery plan is if one of the other councils, so we are having that conversation around joint, but if one of the other councils says this isn't preferred, then actually they're going to go off and just do their. Are we still getting that joint water service delivery plan? How does that all work?
Our timeframes are set up as once we've got consultation done and we've made a decision, we will then write the water service delivery plan.
Okay, and so my question is that you're competent under whatever iteration, whether it's joint or by ourselves, standalone, you've got time to make sure that's...
Yeah, Mike will speak more to that, the one on the screen, but that's the plan.
Yeah, okay, no, perfect. Yeah, Michelle, and then...
But bringing in...
I guess, so your fallback position would be that I would assume that you'd set up your own independent unit organisation with shares, and those shares would have a value, and if the other guys decide to come at a later date, that those shares, they have to pay whatever the shares were going to cost at that time to enter. I was just thinking about the Waitaki side of things. If they were part of the entity, that would dilute the costs to us by another 33%. So those are the sorts of things that we need to be considering. And definitely the fallback position, we create a structure that will actually accommodate people to come in at a later date, I think would be the most sensible thing to do.
Give Michelle, yeah.
I was just going to make a comment on our consultation document, and I know we have to go out with a preferred option, but I read the Ashburton one, and I may get myself in trouble here, but I felt this was very biased. And if you didn't agree with what they were saying, I just went, that's not true, and then distrusted the whole document. So I really want our document to be really objective, and I'd almost suggest giving it to somebody who disagrees with our preferred option to read and get their view on it, because we know there's a little bit of an inherent distrust of what council does in the community, and so if you read it with that lens, it may help us deliver a more objective document, even though we have a preferred option that doesn't just feel like propaganda to sway to what we think.
Yeah, well, one of the challenges you're going to have is perhaps a community perception of corporatisation of the water's assets, and that's something, a message we've really got to get across, that this is no way is this corporatisation, and the assets will still remain in community ownership.
So I mean, this is effectively what's happened to Lyons, many decades ago. So, it's not too dissimilar, really, is it? We're just a few decades late on water. So, and we know. Righty. So where did we get to? Anything further?
If we did set up our own entity on our own, as I suggested before, any outwork would have to be done on a commercial basis. So therefore, if someone came to us and wanted services from our organisation, that would be done in a profitable manner and not on a cost plus, like a lot of things seem to occur.
I think we might need to double check what the legislation allows a water services organisation to do, because it's been very clear that CCO for that is only allowed to deliver water services. So I'm not sure what the contractual is for delivering it outside of the area. Yeah.
The organisation will be heavily regulated by the Commerce Commission and is not a profit-making organisation. It's just simply covering costs.
Doing stuff for other people, we wouldn't do it at cost, would we? That would be stupid. We'd do it at a profit margin of probably 40 or 50%.
So, and I'm not sure what the impact of the legislation's been to date, but Watercare has devolved all of their activities outside of Auckland. So they've sold off their labs that they had around the country. They've withdrawn from the Waikato District Council management contract. They've dropped everything.
I think there is one thing we've got to change our language. This is a WSO, it's not a CCO. And as set out in these papers, they are fundamentally very different in terms of what you have to do in a WSO and what you're required to do. And it is a lot more regulated. So we need to make sure we start using that language, WSO.
And so the purposes of getting that 500%, we need to be in a WSO, don't we?
Yep.
So really that's the bottom line for us.
Yep.
Yeah, you love the debt limit. Yeah. We heard it. It's recorded. Alrighty, so Mike, have you got anything further to take us through?
No, nothing further from me. Thank you.
No, brilliant. Thank you. I think that was really good. Yes, sorry. As far as next steps for us, we've got a paper next week. Is that next week? Is it? Yes.
That's right. Yeah, you've got a paper next week, which is really signing off the consultation document and a formal resolution of the preferred option.
Please get it, not at 7:30 in the morning of the decision making. I started work at 7 o'clock this morning, and so I haven't been able to catch up on everything that came up overnight. So can you try and get it out a couple of days before, please? Yeah, well, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
Probably Friday.
They're always on time, aren't they?
Alrighty, on that heavy note, we'll close this session off, and then we've got, as far as the public goes, we have 3 p.m, is it? Is that the next one? Yeah, for catching up on the theatre and stadium projects and where they're at. Thank you.